Vladimir Putin has been openly aggressive in Ukraine for more than 2 years now. But his war of conquest is not confined to Ukraine. He's also clearly exerting influence in other former Soviet states as well, for instance, in Georgia and Moldova. Georgia has passed a controversial legislation that labels non-governmental organizations as foreign agents, leading to weeks of heavy protests. The legislation is being regarded as a copy of a similar Russian law. In Moldova, which is due to hold presidential elections and a referendum on joining the EU later this year, Russia is being accused of targeting the public space by spreading disinformation. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is considering allowing Ukraine to use American weapons on Russian territory. So today on To The Point, we are discussing, is Russia's battle for influence spreading from Ukraine to Georgia and Moldova? Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Isha Bhatia Sanan here in Berlin. And today my guests are Gustav Gressel. He is a senior policy fellow and military expert with the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR. Anastasia Pokyunban. She is an analyst for Eastern Europe at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. And joining us via Skype from Warsaw, we have Terry Schulz. She is EU and NATO reporter at DW. A very warm welcome to you all. Gustav, the German foreign minister was in Ukraine recently, and she said that the situation has worsened drastically. Now, we know she had planned to go to Kharkiv. She could not because of security reasons. How is the situation now in Ukraine? It's been more than 2 years.
Well, Ukraine is at a very difficult time in this war. It has been difficult, it will be difficult. Part of that was the delay in aid, both from Europe and the US. It's widely known that the US were late, but also European ammunition initiatives were late. And the problem is that Ukrainian armed forces had lost a lot of personnel because of this delayed. And losing soldiers means losing skills, losing people that have experience, losing people that have a knowledge in what they're doing. It's very hard to retrain people to something. So that is something that has damaged their combat power quite considerably. The second thing is that the Russian army has, compared to with the Russian army that has invaded in 2022, grown to roughly twice the size in terms of men even more, but in terms of material, they grow twice the size. But on Ukrainian side, you have not even the losses replaced by Western equipment, the losses that occurred since 2022. Also, you have a large problem of de facto obsolescence of equipment you can't find ammunition for. Particularly, of course, refers to air missiles, air defense missiles, but that affects also a lot of Ukrainian artillery, tank force, mechanized vehicles where you don't get spare parts or you don't get ammunition for it. And that has led to Ukraine's practical combat power decreasing and Russian combat power increasing, and Russia now with this summer offensive trying to make gains on that.
So Ukraine is clearly not in a good spot. Anastasia, technically, Zelensky's 5-year term as president ended on the 20th of May. But of course, he will continue being the president because of martial law. Now, his critiques say that this is non-constitutional. How are people looking at this in Ukraine?
I mean, that's a fair question, and it has been discussed a lot, especially last year. I'd argue the critique mostly comes from Russia, or Russian allies. There was also an idea launched by the US last year, but it was quickly dismissed as well, and the EU partners support Ukraine in not holding elections. There are multiple reasons why elections would not be appropriate at the current time. First of all, Ukraine is not able to ensure safe and fair and secure elections. More than 20% of Ukraine territory is occupied at the moment. Therefore, people cannot vote in these territories. It would be very difficult to ensure that people on the control line are able to vote due to increased security concerns. Then Ukraine has around 8 million refugees all around the world. Ensuring their presence at the voting stations would be as well very complicated. And this is not just speaking of the financial concerns. Where would the money come from for elections? And Zelensky has made it very clear that the money coming for military equipment and for continuing the war cannot be used for elections. And additionally, a group of opposition parties also agreed that elections would not be now appropriate because this would also mean electoral competition. It would mean resources, while all the efforts should go for the war. And I have to say, I mean, there are also constitutional. Ukraine would need to change its constitution to hold elections. But at the same time, also, it would be important. It's not illegal not to have elections at the moment. So we have precedents where the country can continue the situation before some sort of a peace comes in place. And last November, around 80% of people in Ukraine supported that idea of waiting with the elections.
So, of course, it is difficult, extremely difficult to hold elections at this point because of practical reasons. The reason I ask you this question is because since the beginning of the war, we are talking about democracy versus an authoritarian regime. And now, if Zelensky continues to be the president without being elected again, would that not fuel Putin's propaganda machine? You said it in the beginning also that the critique mostly comes from Russia.
I mean, what will not fuel Putin's propaganda regime? You know, I think we should not look at what Russian propaganda is coming with. You know, we have the legitimate reason why Ukraine cannot hold elections. And also, I believe us as European partners, putting this pressure on Ukraine would not be right just at the moment due to the reasons I mentioned. And I mean, I think, sure, what can be done is to dismiss these arguments. But when a state where we know how the president was elected in Russia raises undemocratic concerns about Ukraine, I think, taking this seriously is also, I don't know, what does it say about us and our democracy?
Yeah. Right. I also might add, none of the opposition parties wants to run against the president who is commander-in-chief in a war situation. Because if you start to criticize the president, and then also for Ukraine, there are a lot of, looking at Ukraine going into the war, of course, there are some things that after the war can be politicized, but now you can't. You can't have a real good debate about all this stuff. So all contenders, all possible contenders, those politicians who think they might challenge Zelensky at a later point, know and want that this will come after the war, because now they would just lose out and do more harm to them and their country than do. And that differs Ukraine from other situations where you have an opposition that wants to run an election against a sitting president. Mm-hmm. I mean, in Belarus, of course, the opposition wants to run a fair election against the sitting president. But this is totally different in Ukraine.
It's a different situation.
And we should also talk to the opposition and take them seriously on that.
Right. Let's go to Terry quickly. She's been waiting for us patiently. Thanks for your patience, Terry. Now, ever since the beginning of the war, there have been concerns that Ukraine would not be the last country where Putin would try to have his influence. And there have been talks about countries like Moldova. Now, tell us just how vulnerable is a country like Moldova, which does not even share a border with Russia, to Putin's encroachment?
Well, there have been concerns much longer than since the beginning of Russia's war on Ukraine. And that's because Putin ensures that Moldova worries about this kind of thing. You know, it has a piece of territory, Transnistria, which is about 4,000 square kilometers and about 400,000 people, which has remained loyal to Moscow since the Soviet Union crumbled. So for more than 30 years. And this tiny area sometimes even asks Putin for protection. Now, remember, when Putin says that he needs to protect Russian speakers, this is the kind of language that we heard before he invaded Donbass in 2014 and took Crimea. He said these kind of things again in 2022 before he went into Ukraine. It's sort of language that people in the countries near to Russia understand, that this could signal that Putin wants to go into this territory. He would absolutely love to create a land corridor between Russia and Transnistria, because as you mentioned, he doesn't have a border with Moldova. But this is something that the country has always lived with since its re-independence. And that's why the pro-EU president, Maia Sandu, has very much strengthened ties with Brussels. Now, Moldova is neutral by constitution, so there's not a lot of talk about joining NATO, of course, but she just this week signed a defense agreement with the European Union, and she had also done this earlier bilaterally with France. And this is going to help security cooperation with the European Union in areas like cybersecurity, counterterrorism, even border management. So this is something that Moldova has always known is vulnerable, and it's doing what it can in this, very vulnerable neighborhood to strengthen itself, to become more resilient.
Thanks, Terry. Now, Moldova does not share a border with Russia, but Georgia does. The country has approved a controversial foreign agent law that has sparked weeks of mass protests. Under the new law, civil society organizations and media that receive more than 20% of their revenues from abroad will be obliged to register as organizations serving the interests of a foreign power.
People in Tbilisi are continuing to protest without rest, even after the Georgian parliament passed the controversial law classifying certain organizations as foreign agents. Opponents are calling the new regulation Russian law. From now on, according to Russian precedent, NGOs and independent media must disclose their financial support from abroad.
We're standing here today in order to protect our future, to protect our rights of speech, of free speech, and the basic fundamental rights that govern all democratic societies across the world.
I'm a researcher. I'm working as a Soviet past researcher, one of the non-governmental organization, Tbilisi-based non-governmental organization, and nowadays, today, after they approved the law, I am foreign agent here. I'm standing here as a foreign agent.
Debate about the law is revealing the division in Georgian society. Young people especially are afraid of Putin's growing influence and that their country might turn away from the West. Will Georgia be the next state to fall back into Russia's sphere of influence?
Anastasia, why did Georgia feel the need to bring in such an anti-democratic law?
This is a very important question because everyone asks this. In fact, Georgian Dream didn't have to do it. They could have preserved the power without bringing in this law. I would say there is really a fear coming from the leadership of the party that they are losing the power. This law, while it's labeled as Russian law and very much inspired by Russian legislation, doesn't come on Russian demand. It really comes from the Georgian leadership, from Georgian Dream, in the attempt to preserve the power over the country. The fears were that the upcoming elections, Georgian Dream would not get the majority. However, I believe that the party underestimated Georgian population, and this is not a repressive regime. This is a country full of people who want to preserve their democracy, and people will be on the street. So I think it was really an underestimation from the ruling party. They have been in power already for quite a long time, and their support has been declining over the past years. And Georgian Dream is perceived as a very corrupt party that are trying to maintain the grip on the power and really sliding Georgia into a kleptocratic and undemocratic regime. But the people are resilient in the country. And I think this was maybe... it's very hard to say what was the expectation from the Georgian Dream and what was the motivation behind this, because they have been rigging elections before. So I think there could have been other tools applied to maintain the power. And to me, this step also shows that that triggered the population to be on the street. And Georgian Dream, I honestly, I see it more optimistic, but I really think that Georgian population will be stronger than this.
Let's look at the effects of passing this legislation. Well, it's not just a protest. Terry, the EU has warned that the adoption of this law will hamper chances of joining the bloc. Georgia has candidacy status at the moment. And then you also have US saying that Georgia will become an adversary rather than a partner. How is the Georgian government reacting to all of this?
And you also have NATO, I should point out, also speaking out against this. And Georgia has traditionally very much wanted to become a member of NATO. So you've really got all the major organizations, plus the U.S. putting pressure on the Georgian dream, basically. But it has seemed to backfire so far. You know, they haven't backed down on this. And in fact, they're saying, look at all the undue influence that foreign actors want to put on Georgia. This is why we need this rule. So it really hasn't worked so far. Of course, the law has not been implemented yet. So there's still time, perhaps, for these kind of levers to work. But at the moment, they don't show any sign of backing down. At the same time, you asked about EU membership, and they have not also backed away from wanting to become a member of the European Union. So that may be where the pressure can still be applied. At the same time, the EU is so angry about this that it's talking about rolling back some of the privileges that Georgia has had, like visa-free travel, for example. And there are some countries that are saying there should be sanctions put on Georgia. So this is really a long way from the joy where the country was, introduced as a candidate. And EU foreign ministers are going to talk about this next week.
So it's clearly backfiring. Talking of EU, Gustav, now EU likes to be seen as this big family that has diverse opinions, and it wants to include as many countries as possible. But by doing so, isn't EU weakening itself? Now, we have the examples of Slovakia, we have the example of Hungary, where we realize that it did become counterproductive. And now it's not just Georgia. EU is also thinking about Serbia, about Montenegro, about Albania. What do you make of it?
Well, the thing is not enlargement, or enlargement per se. The problem is you need to be tough on democratic standards, freedom of press, independence of the judiciary, because if you let them slide, and that was happened in Hungary, then this opens up for this kind of quasi-authoritarian rule that then destroys policymaking in the EU. And that is why, for example, on Georgia, of course, the EU is now stricter. It's not a just sort of issue of taste, but the problem is that Georgian dream has been criticized for state capture, for rolling back judicial reform, for nepotism, for hindering the fight against corruption over the past years. And basically now all these grievances break into the open when they try to curtail or criminalize those organizations that still report on all these misdeeds. And that is of course the issue where you can say no. If you're going down that road, the door to the EU is closed. On the other hand, we see other countries that knock on the EU's doors that have made remarkable progress on this and that have reformed.
And you see countries inside the EU that have done all those things, like Hungary, that actually have enacted laws like this and kicked out positive influence from other countries. So Georgia also sees that example, and it's hypocritical.
So the issue inside and outside is to be more principlist about democratic values and basic freedoms, and that is irrespective of accession and not. It is a shame that our Article 7 procedures are so cumbersome, and that now, of course, that Hungary finds allies to protect itself within the EU. But on the other hand, if you, for example, look at Ukraine and the progress of Ukrainian reforms over the years, they rightfully knock on the door and say, look, guys, they are better in democratic standards, much better than Hungary itself. Why shouldn't they? So I would separate the issue of enlargement with that.
If I just may very briefly add, I think also the environment has become very transactional, and Hungary is trying to obtain deals, not to block accession. And I also think it will be the same with Georgia. Hungary is lobbying very strongly for Georgia in terms of the EU accession, and this can be used, to open now accession talks for Ukraine and Moldova as a bargain token. And I think here it's really important, what was also mentioned previously, that EU still maintains its norms and values in this very transactional environment that we're living in.
And all of
but
that
it's
is
a
still...
very poisoned offer. I mean, the Hungarians want Serbia in and they want Georgia in because of their deficits. And they're not the only ones. The Austrians are also pushing for Serbia because Serbia under Vucic would be a roadblock for the EU to be stricter on financial controls, on fight against espionage, on Russian influence, on corruption laws, the EU prosecutory service on financial crimes. That is a horror scenario for Viktor Orban, but it also undermines the kind of usual policy making in Vienna or Bratislava. And they want to have a rescue against that. And they see that Georgian Dream or Vucic or an unreformed Bosnia are a kind of rescue service and allies to dilute anti-corruption policies within the EU. So again, it is about democratic standards, and they should govern whom we take in and whom not.
Right. It's a long debate about what's happening in the EU, but let's come back to Ukraine, because currently it appears that Putin may be gaining the upper hand in Ukraine, largely due to the West's inadequate support. Analysts say Ukraine hasn't faced such a severe military challenge since the early days of the war. This situation has prompted a new plan that outlines specific steps for Ukraine's membership in NATO as early as July 2028.
The paper suggests that Ukraine could become a member of the Western military alliance by 2028, regardless of whether the war has ended or not. In the meantime, allied countries are called on to increase their aid to 0.25% of their GDP. Air defense for Western Ukrainian border regions could also be managed from NATO territory. And until Ukraine joins NATO, all types of conventional weapons could be supplied. The stipulation that they not be used against targets in Russia should be dropped. What are the chances of this new draft paper being implemented?
2028, isn't that too late?
Well, from a position of Bucharest 2008, it's much too late, but the problem is now the war is already there. Well, looking at Sweden and Finland and how difficult that was, I think it is a bit elusive to propose exact dates for membership, because this is a negotiation process amongst 32 allied countries. And that will be difficult with the respect of some countries. On the other hand, I see a huge inconsistency in policy that, especially looking back at Vilnius last year, when Ukraine talked or wanted at least a political commitment to an invitation, if conditions arise then, that those countries who are either formally or informally in favor of a negotiated settlement with Russia do not support or are very hesitant on Ukraine's NATO membership, because if you have a kind of stalemate agreement, we had these in the past and none of them worked, neither Minsk I nor Minsk II nor any other agreement. If you want to have the war really to end, you need a security net for Ukraine to signal to Moscow not an inch further. And that would be NATO membership. The most practical and the most actually effective would be NATO membership. So here the West is utterly inconsistent. And of course, this paper pokes into the political inconsistency.
We have 2 minutes left. Terry, now, we know that Russia's military has begun drills involving tactical nuclear weapons. Will that have an effect on this decision, on this proposal, rather?
Russia has nuclear tests, nuclear exercises, we should say, all the time. The important thing is that NATO consistently says that they have not seen Russia making a true change in its military posture when it comes to nuclear weapons, and that's what would be the key for real concern about whether Russia intended to use nuclear weapons. Putin has threatened it many times and has not made those moves that would indicate to the alliance that it needed to really worry about a Russian nuclear attack.
Thank you. Anastasia, last question. Now, we're clearly seeing here there are two different strategies. There's this military method in Ukraine. There's the non-military method, hybrid measures, as they're called, in other countries, Georgia, Moldova. Which strategy, according to you, is working better for Putin?
I think when it's not a comparison, that's the issue about Russia. All the strategies come together, and this is what we should deter. We should not look only at the military attacks, but the hybrid attacks, including in the EU countries and in the candidate countries.
So it should be seen as a package that Putin is having as a strategy together. That's all the time we have. What do you think about it? Which strategy is working better for Putin? If you're watching us on YouTube, do let us know your thoughts. We'll be reading your comments. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.